So 5 minutes to talk about ROI. That's enough time, isn't it?
Yeah.
So last one, this is where we do a question. Question from one of our clients recently was a really good one and is related to what we were just talking about. How do you get ROI reporting at the campaign level? And then in this context, the campaign means a little bit of two things. One, your offer. So think about Salesforce campaign, your event, your online event, etc. Any of those kind of offers, and then relative to also, the channels driving conversions on those offers. But then also from maybe like a parent campaign, like we're doing this group of initiatives around something. How can we get ROI on that? So you have 4 minutes to break it down.
Well, one is really tricky when you're trying to just maybe facilitate like a Salesforce campaign structure for getting ROI. This is one of the things that we post even to ourselves, because we find there's this, there's two things that like companies struggle with in terms of picking their Salesforce campaign structure. It's like, do you go the way that takes a shitload of time in campaigns where you're literally building out, you take your offer and you have your offer channel, so you can actually allocate cost well enough?
And for those, if you want to allocate cost by a time period in that Salesforce campaign, you have to recreate all of those campaigns
by time period.
If it's like every month you want to see that, you have to recreate hundreds of campaigns every single month, right?
Yeah, and we have clients that do that, and it like kind of they want to rip their hair out. The second thing is also if you want to go the simplified way, then you just have a general offer campaign that then you would track your UTMs on the campaign members, see what channel they came from. Again, there isn't a sense really of time except for when they became part of that campaign. But then how do you allocate cost, right? Like where do you put then the cost that's tied to that? And so and then there's so that's like the structure in terms of like how you can,
on the responses side,
how you can allocate cost. And then, the struggle of like, well, how in general, then like, how am I tracking the cost of like channels? And then there is how do I then also like, which responses do I try and like what revenue? Like how do I get the revenue to tie to those responses? Is it just first touch attribution? Is it the multi-touch? And then is it linear? Is it last touch? Tipping point?
All have pros and cons.
And some people will try to do a little bit of both, which is also very confusing for an org. And then if you're doing multi-touch attribution, depending on what you consider a touch point, can dilute everything. Because not only are you diluting the touch points, you're also diluting it by channel. And so then you're looking at the data and you're like, well, how do I make sense of this? Because the ROI is going to look like pennies, but across the board. And so, so for everyone who's thinking, ROI is, just simple. You just take, revenue minus cost divided by cost. It's like, no. It's actually very complicated when you're trying to get it down to a campaign. So we were having a conversation and brainstorm because we're like, okay, we need to draw a line in the sand for clients to demystify it. And I don't know.
We probably need a long, maybe next podcast we'll do a whole section on it, because we probably need to dig into it a lot more. So first thing I'll say is it's hard, really hard to get it down at the campaign level. Getting it from the total level, like I mentioned in the ABM side, not that hard, right? You have your total cost and you have your total revenue, and you kind of figure it out from there.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to figure out like how do we get down to that next level, you open up this huge can of worms of, okay, how do we know how much revenue is actually coming from each campaign?
And revenue is a lagging indicator.
It takes a while, yeah.
And a lot of the time what people are trying to do is look at, okay, revenue from this quarter compared to cost.
Well, that's another whole massive complication, right? But like, even just getting how much revenue you can get from a campaign is a very complicated question, right? Because like you said, are you using like first touch, last touch, tipping point attribution, or are you doing multi-touch? Each of those, the choice you make there on how you attribute revenue to a campaign, which is obviously what you need to do as first step in ROI reporting, is a massive decision. Because say you use tipping point, Now, all of your marketers who do more pipeline acceleration campaigns are going to be pissed off because their campaigns are going to not show ROI. If you do multi-touch and kind of a linear where you give, you split out the opportunity value equally across all of the touch points, there's a lot of dilution, and then like your high volume touch points maybe get the lion's share of everything, right? So that is a very big decision, right? So I think you have to weigh things like, okay, what type of marketing we're doing. If we're like a really early stage startup and basically everything that we're doing is to try and like drive new leads, then maybe you do tipping point. If you're like a bit of a
tipping point,
tipping point meaning like the source of what drove them to sales, right? Like kind of an MQL source or a sales ready source. If you're a much bigger org, you're doing lots of marketing across the whole life cycle, you probably won't want to lean more towards multi-touch linear, even if it is more complicated. So that's one thing.
But then being really clear around what touch points like you're including, like maybe not including
sales touch points.
Sales touch points, or like an email click, which is some things we see.
Exactly. Yeah. So don't dilute it even further.
Right.
And then the other side of the equation is costs.
Yeah.
So what you also need to do is figure out with your finance team or others is how are we allocating all of these costs to campaigns as well? Because essentially what you need is two different databases, one that has cost per campaign or channel, and you're going to have to break that down in a certain way. And then the other side, you need revenue by campaign channel.
Yeah.
And then you need to be able to match those things together. So you mentioned creating loads of Salesforce campaigns. That's one way that you could do it, because you can put a cost in a campaign, but you have to create multiple campaigns for all the time periods and then all of the channel offer combinations. One way you can do it is you have the two databases and you just kind of bring them together in an Excel file. That's probably like step one. Like get all of your revenue by campaign and offer, and also campaign and channel, and then go get all your cost data, bring it into a sheet, line it all up, and now you can get those calculations. That's kind of step one. Or you can create custom objects, in Salesforce. You could get data in like a web data warehouse and use a BI tool to do all of it. But essentially, you have to have obviously both sides of those equations, and you have to really think through a way to match them together, right? So like on the cost side, you might have a cost for paid ads in March, but on the Salesforce response tracking and attribution side, you might have those paid ads all broken out by multiple campaigns or like multiple different offers. So you need to figure out, how do I group that all into one row, so then I can just get like a apples to apples, like this is how much spent on paid ads and this is how much revenue we got out of it. So we'll do more podcasts on this, but there are a few things to think about, like what model you're going to choose to attribute revenue to each of the kind of cost categories.
Yeah.
How are you categorizing costs with finance? How do you get a link between those two things with that cost category, so you can understand like how to link them, so you can say, well, this is the revenue that came from this amount of budget. And, probably early on, that's maybe happening manually. And then you can grow into having something a bit more automated. But probably what I would recommend isn't trying to have it all perfectly automated from the beginning, like having all those costs in Salesforce and having like having to do all of those Salesforce campaigns.
Yeah.
So some things to think about. It's really hard though. It's really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Companies are like, oh, we don't know how to, like, I don't blame them.
I would focus even before ROI.
Like, I was just getting good.
I would just try and get first good funnel lifecycle data.
Yeah.
Figure out what's happening at the tipping point, what's tipping over to sales, so you can optimize what you're sending to sales and what's converting through into pipeline. Get some good, solid campaign response data, and use a multi-touch attribution tool or data model in Salesforce to be able to see all of the touch points, start analyzing that. Exhaust those two things, and then you can start getting into all these ROI. But some people go straight to ROI, but you can't even see what your conversion rates are in your funnel, or you don't even have good data on any of the responses. And you're nowhere near ROI reporting.
Yeah, and then if you are doing the multi-touch attribution, I think knowing that things are a lagging indicator, I think getting to like a first half or like a year-long like kind of data, looking at how much you spent in a certain channel for that year, and then looking at how much revenue you got from that channel within a year, it's not going to be perfect, but if you're just starting out, I think that could be really telling too. Because like content syndication, you might spend $1 million, but maybe you only got like 50 grand, So, hey, that's a good sign. So at least approaching it, I think by a channel at least gives you directional data in terms of like what channels to invest in. And then you can maybe dig into your campaigns and look at, okay, well, which campaigns actually drove that revenue and then which ones didn't. Like that's a very simplified way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Still hard.
Still hard, but yeah.
Simpler.
Simpler.
Okay.
All right. Well,
there we have it.
We really got into things. That's fun.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for joining. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to share it with a colleague or friend, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.